The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the air as passengers began boarding the luxury flight. Sofia Mendez stepped onto the jet bridge, clutching her boarding pass with a quiet confidence. She wasn't one to seek attention. Her simple yet graceful demeanor set her apart from the extravagance surrounding her. Dressed in a modest but elegant navy blue dress, she walked forward, her steps light but purposeful. Unlike the others in the first-class line, she wasn't weighed down by designer bags or dripping in expensive jewelry. The only accessory she carried was a delicate watch on her wrist, a sentimental gift from her husband, Eduardo. It wasn't flashy, but to her, it meant everything. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, the contrast between her and the other passengers was undeniable. The air smelled of fresh leather seats, fine champagne, and luxury perfumes. The flight attendants, perfectly groomed and clad in crisp navy uniforms, moved with practiced elegance, tending to passengers who barely acknowledged their presence. Men in tailored suits glanced up briefly before returning to their newspapers, their gold cufflinks gleaming under the cabin lights. Women in expensive silk dresses adjusted their diamond necklaces while murmuring about exclusive resorts and private investments. It was a world where wealth was worn like armor, and appearances determined one's worth. Sofia was no stranger to this world, yet she never felt the need to prove she belonged. She had built her life on values deeper than material riches. Despite being married to one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, she still preferred a quiet life, far from the constant need to flaunt status. Eduardo had insisted on booking this first-class seat for her, telling her she deserved every bit of comfort after months of hard work on a charity project she had poured her heart into. He had promised to meet her at their resort later, leaving her to enjoy this moment of luxury on her own. As she made her way to her seat, she felt a few eyes linger on her, some curious, others judgmental. She could almost hear the unspoken question, does she really belong here? But Sofia had faced these silent judgments before, and she had long since learned to rise above them. With a calm smile, she handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant, unaware that this simple action would set off a chain of events that would soon change the entire dynamic of the flight. Sofia extended her boarding pass with a polite smile, expecting nothing more than a routine check. But the moment the flight attendant, Camila Reynolds, took the ticket, a flicker of skepticism crossed her perfectly made-up face. She was tall, impeccably groomed, and carried herself with an air of superiority. Her French manicured fingers held the ticket as if it were something questionable, something that didn't quite belong in her polished world. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Camila said, her tone clipped and professional, but laced with an unmistakable hint of condescension. "There seems to be a mistake. This section is for first-class passengers only." She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that barely touched the surface, the kind meant to put someone in their place without raising her voice. Sofia blinked, momentarily taken aback. "There's no mistake. My husband booked this seat for me," she replied calmly, not letting the sudden attention from nearby passengers shake her composure. Camila let out a quiet sigh, as if she had heard this excuse 100 times before. She glanced at the ticket again, flipping it over as though expecting to find proof of fraud. "Let me just double-check something," she said, though her expression made it clear that she had already made up her mind. A man seated nearby lowered his newspaper, his sharp eyes taking in Sofia's modest attire. His gold cufflinks gleamed under the cabin lights as he smirked. "Happens all the time," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "People from economy trying to sneak into first class. It's getting out of hand." A woman in an elegant designer dress leaned toward her husband, whispering something while glancing at Sofia with barely concealed amusement. Her diamond necklace sparkled as she chuckled under her breath. Camila, now fully convinced of her assumption, gave Sofia another tight-lipped smile. "I can check if there's an available seat in economy for you," she offered, her voice dripping with false kindness. "It might be more comfortable there." Sofia felt her face heat up, but she refused to let the embarrassment show. She kept her posture straight, her voice even. "I have a valid first-class ticket. I am supposed to be here." The murmurs around her grew louder. Some passengers exchanged knowing looks, while others barely concealed their smirks. The flight crew whispered among themselves, exchanging glances that suggested they had already decided how this situation would unfold. For the first time, a flicker of frustration sparked in Sofia's chest. She had spent years working hard, never expecting special treatment despite being married to Eduardo. And now, without knowing anything about her, these people had already judged her unworthy. But she wasn't about to let them define her place in the world. She met Camila's gaze, unwavering. Check again. Sophia took a slow, steady breath, keeping her expression calm despite the growing humiliation pressing in on her from all sides. She had faced challenges before, and she wasn't about to back down now. She stood firm, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her voice carried quiet strength. "There is no mistake," she repeated, meeting Camila's gaze without flinching. "This is my seat, and I will not be moving." Camila's smile tightened, the patience in her expression wearing thin. The flight attendant wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she had already dismissed in her mind. With a quick motion, she gestured toward another crew member and spoke in a low voice. But Sophia still caught the words. "Call the manager. Let him deal with this." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The businessman with the gold cufflinks let out an exaggerated sigh, tapping his fingers impatiently against the armrest. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "Some of us have places to be." The woman with the diamond necklace smirked, nudging her husband as if to say, "Watch this." A moment later, the cabin manager arrived, his expression carefully neutral but his posture authoritative. He was an older man, his uniform pristine, his demeanor polished from years of handling difficult situations. "Ma'am, we seem to have an issue with your reservation," he said, his voice measured and professional. "To avoid further delay, I'll have to ask you to step off the aircraft while we verify your ticket." The request was framed as polite, but the message was clear: leave quietly or be forced to. A few passengers shifted in their seats, enjoying the unfolding scene as if it were entertainment. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to speak up. Sophia clenched her fingers briefly, then forced herself to release them. The easiest solution would be to say her husband's name. One word, Vasquez, and everything would change. The sneers would disappear, the whispers would turn into apologies, and Camila's entire demeanor would shift in an instant. But the thought of it made her stomach turn. Why should she have to rely on her husband's name to be treated with basic respect? She took a deep breath and looked the manager in the eye. "My ticket is valid," she said, her voice unwavering. "I am not leaving this plane." A thick silence filled the cabin. Camila crossed her arms, waiting for the final blow to be delivered. The manager hesitated for only a second before reaching for his radio, prepared to escalate the situation further. But before he could speak, the aircraft door opened again. A figure stepped inside, and in that moment, the entire atmosphere of the cabin shifted. The hiss of the aircraft door opening cut through the tense silence. Heads turned instinctively, passengers pausing their conversations, and even Camila, who had been brimming with quiet satisfaction, glanced toward the entrance. A tall figure stepped inside, his presence alone shifting the entire energy of the cabin. Eduardo Vasquez, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who never had to raise his voice to be heard. His silver-threaded dark hair was neatly styled, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with calm precision. He wasn't just any wealthy businessman. He was the kind of man whose presence alone demanded attention. But most importantly, he was the owner of the very airline they were standing in. His gaze settled on Sophia, standing firm despite the judgmental stares around her. Then his eyes moved to the cabin manager, who still held his radio, frozen mid-action, and finally to Camila, whose posture had stiffened in realization. But Eduardo's expression remained unreadable, his voice even as he spoke. "Is there a problem with my wife's seat?" The question, though simple, carried a weight that made the entire first-class cabin hold its breath. The words sank in slowly, like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the room. A man in an expensive suit straightened in his seat, his smug expression disappearing. The woman with the diamond necklace looked down, suddenly very interested in adjusting her bracelet. Even the businessman with the gold cufflinks, who had been so quick to judge moments ago, shifted uncomfortably. Camila's face lost all color, her usual air of authority vanishing in an instant. "You are your wife?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The manager, normally so composed, looked equally shaken. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his uniform as if trying to regain control of a situation that had already slipped far beyond his grasp. Eduardo took a slow step forward, his gaze steady. Yes, my wife. The woman you were just attempting to remove from my airline's first-class cabin. His voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. The weight of his words settled like a heavy cloud over the room. A flight attendant in the background quickly straightened her posture, suddenly unsure where to look. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the extent of their mistake. No one dared to speak. Camila opened her mouth as if to explain, to justify, but there were no words that could undo what had already been done. The power in the room had shifted completely, and now, all she could do was brace for what came next. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick with tension, as Eduardo's gaze swept across the room. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough. He looked at the cabin manager first, then at Camila, who stood frozen, her confident demeanor now completely shattered. The shift in power was undeniable. Only moments ago, she had been so sure of herself, so certain that Sophia didn't belong. Now, she looked as if she wanted to disappear. Eduardo exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "What exactly made you question my wife's right to be here?" His eyes settled on Camila, who swallowed hard, her throat visibly tightening. Was it her clothes? Her quiet demeanor? The fact that she didn't fit your idea of what a first-class passenger should look like? His words, though calm, cut through the room like a blade. The first-class passengers shifted in their seats, the weight of their own silent judgments pressing down on them. Camila opened her mouth, but no words came out. The manager, his face pale, finally found his voice. "Mr. Vasquez, I assure you, this was simply a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Eduardo repeated, arching a brow. Interesting choice of words. He let the statement hang in the air before continuing. "Did you know that before she was my wife, Sophia was one of the youngest and most respected flight attendants in this airline's history? That she was once commended for saving a passenger's life mid-flight? That she has more knowledge of airline protocols than anyone standing in this cabin right now?" His words landed heavily, and several flight attendants exchanged guilty glances. Some passengers who had smirked at Sophia before now looked away, shame creeping into their expressions. Camila's posture crumbled further, her hands clenching at her sides. The arrogance that had once been so evident was now completely gone. Eduardo took a step closer, his voice even but laced with finality. "Starting tomorrow, all Stellar Airways employees will undergo new anti-discrimination training." He paused, then added, "And you, Miss Reynolds, will be the first to participate." Camila's lips parted in shock, but she didn't dare protest. The message was clear, her actions had consequences. Eduardo then turned to Sophia, his expression softening slightly. "And as for the position of Director of Customer Experience that we've been discussing, I can't think of anyone more qualified." A murmur spread through the cabin as realization dawned. The woman they had mocked, dismissed, and judged was now in a position of power over the very people who had tried to humiliate her. Sophia met Eduardo's gaze, emotions flickering across her face. She hadn't expected this, but as she looked around the room, at the passengers avoiding her eyes, at the humbled flight crew, she realized something. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure no one else would ever be treated this way again. She lifted her chin slightly, accepting the role, and with that, the lesson was complete. As the tension in the cabin eased, the weight of realization settled over everyone. The same passengers who had laughed or whispered now sat in awkward silence. The businessman with the gold cufflinks glanced at Sophia with something that almost resembled guilt. The woman with the diamond necklace fidgeted with her bracelet, avoiding eye contact. A few brave enough to acknowledge their mistake offered quiet apologies, their earlier smugness now replaced with regret. Sophia accepted their words with grace, but she knew the real lesson had already been taught, not just to them, but to everyone in the room. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia and Eduardo sat on the balcony of their beachfront resort. The sound of waves filled the peaceful silence between them. Sophia traced the rim of her wine glass, her thoughts still lingering on the events of the day. "I never wanted special treatment," she admitted, watching the water shimmer under the fading light. "I just wanted to be treated with basic respect." Eduardo studied her for a moment, then reached for her hand. I know, he said softly. That's why I didn't step in sooner. I wanted you to handle it your way. He squeezed her fingers gently before adding. But I also wanted to remind you of something. You've spent so long making a difference behind the scenes, but it's time people see what you're capable of. Sophia looked up at him, puzzled. Eduardo smiled. The position of Director of Customer Experience wasn't just an idea I had today. It was meant to be your anniversary gift. A slow realization spread across Sophia's face. He had believed in her long before today, not because she was his wife, but because of who she was on her own. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, not just love, but a renewed sense of purpose. As the ocean breeze carried away the last traces of the day's tension, Sophia knew this was more than just a promotion. It was the beginning of something new. A reminder that true worth isn't measured by wealth, appearance, or status, but by character, dignity, and the way one treats others.